Welcome to Chronos Talks, a place for some candid thoughts on what might need to change if we're going to get the worlds of sustainable finance and corporate sustainability to generate positive impacts. I'm Gemma James, Chronos' head of Biodiversity and Nature, and today I'm with Rebecca Drury, who is one of our Biodiversity and Nature managers here at Chronos. Rebecca was previously head of wildlife trade at Fauna and Flora International, and she is a member of the UK government's Illegal Wildlife Trade Advisory Group. So hi Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, hello.
So this is the second of a trilogy of podcasts that our team are doing at Chronos. So last time we spoke with Laura Fox on regenerative agriculture, and today we're going to talk about wildlife trade. Now, when we say wildlife trade, I'm sure many people will be thinking of endangered species and the associated products, things like tiger skins, rhino horns. The creature that always pops into my mind are pangolins and their scales. But I think we're talking about something much broader than that. So, Rebecca, can you tell us what we mean by wildlife trade? We're not just talking about fluffy or scaly animals, are we?
No, but you're not alone. So whenever I mention wildlife trade, people tend to think of illegal wildlife trade. So they think of, it's great that you think of pangolins actually, because 10 years ago, nobody had heard of a pangolin. And they are the most trafficked non-human mammal in the world. So it's great that you've heard of pangolins. But yes, everyone tends to think of the more charismatic big mammals. So the elephants and ivory, rhino and their horn. And it's often in the news. But wildlife trade refers to any trade, any commercial trade in plants, animals, fungi, anything that's harvested from the wild. And this covers thousands of different species that are traded commercially globally. And this is for food, it's for fashion, in furniture, alternative medicines, jewellery and ornaments, and of course pets as well. You know, I'm kind of talking about millions of different organisms and their products. So everything from timber to live mammals, coral. And there's a huge amount of trade in plants, so live plants and bulbs, so a lot of snowdrops, orchids, succulents are really fashionable at the moment, so a lot of cacti. And many of these products will be in your homes, in fact. So things like cod, Brazil nuts, argan oil, licorice, for example.
It sounds like we've got a bit of a shopping list there.
Yeah.
If these are common products that we have in our homes and shops and also gardens, by the sounds of it, you know, we've been purchasing and consuming these all of this time. Is that really a problem?
No. So it isn't always a problem. It can actually help to protect nature. So well-managed wildlife trade, it can help protect biodiversity. It can create incentives to protect habitat, for example, and it can support local economies. And there are many local communities around the world who rely on the sustainable use of these products for themselves, but also for trade. But in instances where there is no management, especially in the context of, you know, growing demand from new markets, which we're seeing a lot of, any species that's targeted for commercial trade, we can see a rapid shift from this being harvested in a sustainable way to it being unsustainable. And that's when we should be concerned.
And I guess with that demand, you know, for increasing wildlife products, and global population is increasing, so we're all eating much more fish, for example, than in the past. We've got more of a consumer society and we're buying more stuff that uses more wild ingredients, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen a huge increase in wildlife trade. So a group of academics looked at records of legal international trade over a couple of decades, and this suggested that legal commercial wildlife trade has increased by 2,000% since the 1980s. And that's huge. That's a huge increase. And of course, we're seeing this in the context of lots of other pressures on wildlife too. So habitat loss is increasing, climate change, for example. And, you know, this can be big business. So again, looking at those records of trade between 1997 and 2016, it was estimated that the value of wildlife trade was $220 billion on average each year. And just to put that into context, it's not dissimilar to the combined value of coffee, sugar and cocoa today. And it's way bigger than value of illegal wildlife trade. So it's big business.
If we look at the IPBES assessment, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and that's the technical body which assesses the status and trends in nature loss. The IPBES calls out direct exploitation as one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. And we're saying that demand for wildlife products must mean that wildlife trade contributes to that nature loss. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. A third of wild fish in the ocean are being overfished. More than a tenth of wild trees are threatened by unsustainable logging. So this is driving kind of targeted species declines, but affecting nature more broadly, because this obviously contributes to wider environmental degradation and ultimately the loss of ecosystem services. And if you're familiar with the IUCN Red List, which lists species that have been assessed for threats, a quarter of the species that are listed on that are threatened by overexploitation. So this is a huge driver of loss. And I think IPBES class it as the second largest driver of biodiversity loss overall. And it's the leading cause of marine biodiversity loss. So this is a real concern. And I think it's also really important to mention that things that we think are legally traded actually might be illegally harvested. So 1 in 5 fish that are legally traded, so might appear on the supermarket shelves, are actually thought to have been caught illegally and laundered into the legal system. And this is similar for timber. So it's estimated that between 10 and 30% of global timber trade is thought to have actually been illegally harvested.
With that decline, how do we think that can be managed? Like, what's in place to help prevent trade contributing to wildlife decline? And for example, what are the then laws and regulations in place to help with that?
Yeah, so there is an international mechanism known as CITES to regulate trade across borders, but this does only cover a fraction of species that are commercially traded. So most wildlife trade is legal, but it's often kind of assumed that therefore legal trade is sustainable trade, but this isn't always the case. And in most instances, sustainability hasn't been established. And for, again, the vast majority of species, there's no regulation at all. It's simply not regulated or monitored. So although there are mechanisms in place, there is still a very high risk that much of the wildlife trade that we're seeing, whether regulated or not, could be unsustainable and could be contributing to biodiversity loss.
And if then regulation is lacking, are we relying on the private sector or business to step up to help fill that gap of what should be done properly? So it sounds like there's a wide range of businesses who are involved in commercial trade in products. So this might be the retailers and everyone involved in the logistics, not just those directly at that kind of fishing, logging, harvesting level. What would be the implications of this for business and also the finance sector?
Yeah, so there is a risk that any company that's linked to overexploitation in any way, and investors in turn, that there's a risk that this is linked to biodiversity loss. So whether you're involved in harvest or the use or the trade of the wild species or the products. So as you mentioned, this would include manufacture and retail of things like cosmetics and pharmaceuticals, those foods that I mentioned earlier, beverages, juniper in your gin, for example, argan oil in your shampoo, all those personal care products. And so a lot of companies and investors will be linked to this and perhaps may be unaware of it. We're also seeing a consumer kind of preference shift away from chemical and animal-based ingredients. So this is kind of increasing reliance on plant-based ingredients, which has some positives, but many of these ingredients will be coming from the wild. So this is becoming more relevant for many sectors as well. But there are some companies taking action. So there's a few different companies that are leading in this area. So for example, Neal's Yard is one that sources frankincense from the wild in a couple of different countries. To ensure sustainability, it uses third-party certification. It also pays a premium to those local people who are involved in harvesting it. And it's also supporting kind of positive species restoration in the source areas as well. So there's a lot of companies and investors who'll be impacted this, and there are some companies leading the way. But largely, I'd say a lot of this is happening under the radar, and we're not currently fully assessing and identifying those risks.
I think for the investors in some of these sectors, you mentioned pharmaceuticals, food and beverage, it would actually be interesting to hear directly from them whether wildlife trade is flagging up in their own exposure assessments, just to see whether, they are actually paying attention to it. But moving on, it's interesting that you mentioned local communities involved in harvesting with the Neal's Yard example. I know the TNFD highlights links between nature-related risks and opportunities and human rights. Is that an area that you're seeing as being particularly important for this driver of biodiversity loss?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was some work done actually by the wildlife NGO Traffic. They looked at a kind of selection of key plant-derived medicinal products, and they assessed them both in terms of their ecological risk and their human rights risk. And they actually found really high social risks for many of the ingredients. So this included things like shea butter, argan oil, frankincense, gum arabic. So gum arabic is a bit like palm oil in that it's found in a huge range of products. So it's in soft drinks, it's in sweets, it's in the outer coating of pills. So, really widely used. But all of those had high social risks associated with them. And there are other risks associated with wildlife trade too that people don't tend to think of beyond those social risks, but perhaps with a wider social impact. So, for example, trade in live mammals creates really high risks for the emergence of zoonotic diseases, which is when a disease passes from an animal to a human. So, for example, SARS and COVID, and obviously can have huge social implications. Wildlife trade can also help to introduce invasive species, which invasive species are, in themselves can really contribute to biodiversity loss and can also have really severe impacts on business activities.
So I feel like you're making a pretty compelling case in terms of wildlife trade being integrated into many aspects of our lives, in the products that we consume, but we've got an unregulated market for exploitation of many of the resources like fish, timber, other species. But apart from timber, we haven't really seen wildlife use being talked about or coming up in our conversations with our clients and some of the companies and investors that we work with on nature. Why do you think that is?
No, I completely agree. And I've been thinking a lot about this and trying to understand why this might be. And I think there are a few different reasons. So first of all, I think there's just a general lack of awareness. So, IP BES refer to direct exploitation, TNFD refer to biotic extraction. And, if I say wildlife trade, even though they all overlap, you think of rhinos and pangolins. So I think there's a general kind of lack of awareness of what we're talking about and why it's important. I also think there's kind of an absence of tools. So high risk wild source commodities haven't really been identified. There's no kind of one go-to resource for companies to go and identify these commodities that might be of concern. The TNFD defines high risk commodities as in the context of wildlife exploitation as those that are either listed on CITES, so on the international legislation that governs trade across borders in wildlife and products and their derivatives, or on SBTN's high impact commodity list. But as I mentioned earlier, only a fraction of species in trade are covered by CITES, and very few appear on the commodity list of SBTN. So there's nowhere business can go to easily identify which commodities have these risks. I think another big reason is that assessments of nature-related risks and opportunities are currently focused on direct operations, and partly just to make it manageable in that first instance as people kind of begin to navigate nature-related risks and opportunities in their business activities. But because we're focused on direct operations instead of value chains, which is where harvest of wild source products is material. And then, honestly as well, finally, species exploitation, it's relatively niche. So if you're looking at your nature risks and opportunities across a large portfolio or a large company, water use might come up again and again and again, whereas species exploitation might be quite niche. And so maybe it doesn't make it through that prioritization process that companies and investors have to go through. But having said that, the cumulative impacts on target species for commercial trade can be really severe, and therefore that can still give rise to those physical risks and also reputational risks. So I think it's really important to make sure it's kind of kept on the radar, even if that requires some additional work.
So on your point around direct operations and impacts often being in the value chains, and you also just mentioned cumulative risks and impacts as well. What about indirect impacts? So for industries that could have a large impact on a sensitive area, so like mining, for example. Mining obviously doesn't harvest or trade wildlife, but how can a sector like mining contribute or facilitate it?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because mining and infrastructure has a huge impact on wildlife exploitation indirectly. So when you establish a new mine or you develop new infrastructure associated with that mine or not, typically you're opening up areas of high biodiversity that were previously inaccessible. This means not only greater access to wildlife, but you're also creating better links to markets. You might have new ports, for example, and you might also see often see an increased human population moving into the area. And this can in turn really raise the pressure on the habitats around these operations, but also the wildlife populations living in those habitats. And this should definitely, in my view, be considered an indirect or an induced impact of these kinds of business activities. But I would be honest, I see them rarely documented. So there are data gaps to really hinder our understanding of their contribution. And also in the resources and the guidance available, despite these potentially material contributions to wildlife exploitation, sector guidance typically focuses, when it comes to direct resource use, on things like water, and things like biotic resource use, i.e. wildlife exploitation, is considered of negligible materiality in this sector guidance for the mining sector, for example. And I think that's something we need to change, because although it's not a direct impact, it's still an impact.
And that might be then contributing to why many people wouldn't think of mining and infrastructure as part of the problem. And I think the sectors themselves wouldn't see themselves as part of the problem as well. So we do have this question of materiality and how that's being conveyed. What do you think companies and investors should be doing then?
So companies and investors can make sure, first of all, that any use of wildlife resources in their value chains is being considered when they're assessing their own nature-related risks and opportunities. So like we do for deforestation risk commodities currently, we should be also identifying the risks around wild source commodities and their value chains. I think companies and investors can also help to fill data gaps. So like we just mentioned with mining and the induced impacts, investors could be asking for that data. Companies could be monitoring that data, just so we have a better understanding of their contribution. And also there are lots of actions these companies could be taking to reduce these induced impacts. They're not really difficult to do. So investors could be asking for that data and asking for that action to be taken. And then I think investors and companies could also help to address the gaps in the tools and resources that I mentioned. So, for example, identifying those high-risk wildlife commodities and red flag contexts to help sectors more broadly identify those risks and improve due diligence where necessary. And then finally, thinking about illegal wildlife trade, sectors such as finance, e-commerce platforms, transportation, they can also be unwittingly involved in illegal wildlife trade and laundering proceeds. So there's also a range of actions companies in the finance sector can take to address illegal wildlife trade. So, for example, through enhanced anti-money laundering processes and due diligence processes, for example.
So we always like to end the podcast on something positive. And given that you've just said, all these actions that companies can take, do you then have any positive examples of companies addressing wildlife trade that might give us a little bit of hope for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a growing number of companies who are recognising that this is a risk and are acting on it. So we've got a range of cosmetics companies, for example, like Lush and Natura and L'Occitane. We've got herbal companies like Pucker, who are all placing a real emphasis on responsible sourcing of wild harvested ingredients. There's also the Union for Ethical Biotrade. A lot of companies are members there, which again places a real emphasis on ethical sourcing. That I mentioned the Fair Wild certification earlier in the context of gin. I think there are around 80 companies now who are using that to help source their plant-based ingredients, managing for both social risk and ecological risk. Some fashion brands are now also putting policies in place. So, for example, Kering has clear policies around sourcing fur and precious skins, for example. And there's a couple of investor initiatives popping up as well. So, for example, FAIR are working with WWF and UNEP FI to engage the seafood sector on their nature risks and impacts. And that will include that wild harvest of fish.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So there you have it. I hope this podcast has inspired our listeners to assess and explore wildlife trade more under that driver of direct exploitation when conducting nature risk assessments. Rebecca, thanks so much for your time and imparting your wisdom with us today. And thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, Gemma. It's been fun. Thanks for having me.
And of course, Rebecca's always available if anyone has questions or wants to find out more on the topic. Do have a look at www.chronossustainability.com for more information on the work that our Biodiversity and Nature team are doing, and also other episodes of the Chronos Talks podcast. And follow us on LinkedIn via the handle @Chronos Sustainability for all our news and updates.